Hey, so in this video we're checking out the performance of the final version of the Division 2. I have previously looked at the performance in the private beta, but at that time the built-in benchmark was not working. So instead I used a 30-second run down a road outside the White House, and as we will soon see, the results in the built-in benchmark is somewhat higher than my in-game benchmark run. I also tried to run the same route now as I did in the private beta, and the results are the same. So my previous video with the previous numbers is still relevant when it comes to in-game performance. For testing we have the usual suspects: the Phenom II X6 1090Ti at 3.8 GHz, the FX8350 at 4.5 GHz, the i5-6600K at 4.8 GHz, and the Ryzen R5 1600 at 3.7 GHz. The i5 and R5 used 16 GB of DDR4 memory at 3200 MHz, the older system used 16 GB DDR3 memory at 1600 MHz. For graphics cards, I used the MSI GTX1070 Gaming X, the Sapphire R9 290 Tri-X, and the Gigabyte GTX1660Ti Oc. For the overclocked numbers, the 1070 was running at about 2088 MHz core clock with 9 gigabits per second memory speed. The 1660 Ti was running at about 2000 MHz core clock with 16 gigabytes per second memory speed. I tested at 1080p and 1440p. There was something weird going on at 4K, so I have not included those numbers. I did a few extra tests at 1080p. In 1080p I tested at DirectX 11 versus DirectX 12 with a couple of other tests as well. The built-in benchmark include average CPU and GPU utilization, so we will take a look at those numbers for 1080p. I also recorded VRAM usage, so we will take a look at that as well. So, with all that out of the way, let's dive in. We start off by looking at DirectX 11 with the GTX 1070. Here the i5-6600K is coming out on top with 74.7 frames per second. The Ryzen is a bit behind with 71.3 frames per second, and further down we find the FX8350 with 64.9 frames per second on average, and in the last place is Phenom II with 58.8 frames per second on average. The frame times also gets worse with each step down, as you can see. The GTX1660 Ti's performance is slightly behind the 1070 and the DirectX 11. With the i5-6600K, the 1660 Ti managed 73.8 frames per second on average, with as near as makes no different identical frame times to the 1070. The Ryzen is slightly behind with 70.6 frames per second average, with frame times also 2 to 3 frames behind the i5. The FX8350 did 64.3 frames per second average with some pretty bad frame times, and the Phenom II did even worse with 58.6 frames per second on average. DirectX 11 is not the R9 290's forte, as we can see here. There was not a big difference between the CPUs, but the newer Ryzen and i5 had quite a bit better frame times. The i5-6600K helped the R9 290 squeeze out 42.7 frames per second on average, with all the others coming in very close behind. So how does this compare to the DirectX 12 performance? Well, in DirectX 12, the performance of Ryzen is in second with 78.5 frames per second on average, and the FX8350 did a decent job and got the 1070 to 70.8 frames per second, but the Phenom II could not keep up and stopped at 61.7 frames per second on average. The 1660 Ti is falling further behind the 1070 at DirectX 12. With the i5-6600K, the 1660 Ti did 74.8 frames per second on average. That's 7% behind the 1070. With the R5-1600, the 1660 Ti did 71.2 frames per second average, and the FX8350 did 67.4 frames per second on average, where the Phenom dropped below 60 at 59.8 frames per second average. But the R9 290 is showing some muscle in DirectX 12. Here all CPU managed to feed the R9 290's appetite, and therefore all are averaging around 50 frames per second with very similar frame times between the CPUs. So let's just move on to 1440p, and we start off with the 1070 again. And here still the i5-6600K is still sitting on the top with 52.5 frames per second on average, with the Ryzen coming in very slightly behind at 51.4 frames per second. And the FX and Phenom is keeping up with the pace at this resolution, although the 0.1% low is taking a deep dive on the Phenom. So here we are pretty much GPU bound. So the 1660 Ti is still lagging behind the 1070 at this resolution, which really doesn't come as a surprise, but all CPUs managed around 46 to 47 frames per second on average, with only the R5 and i5 frame times staying above 30 frames per second at all times. With the R9 290, I dropped the weaker CPUs as all seem to perform the same anyway. So at 1440p we're down to 32 frames per second on average, with both the R5 and Ryzen CPU giving you console-like performance. Pairing the 1070 and 1660 Ti with the i5 and overclocking both of them boosts performance with 7% in both cases at 1080p. The 1070 is still coming out on top with 86 frames per second on average versus 80.2 frames per second on average for the 1660 Ti, which is in effect matching a stock 1070. We're also taking a quick look at VRAM usage at the Ultra preset, and these numbers are the peak VRAM usage for the graphics card. At 1080p, DirectX 11, the 1070 had a peak VRAM usage of 6,324 megabytes. The 1660 Ti had a peak usage of 5,092 megabytes. And the R9 290 almost maxing out its 4GB frame buffer with 3,794 megabytes. Switching to DirectX 12 at 1080p, the VRAM usage is dropping, and it dropped to 5,699 for the 1070. For the 1660 Ti, it dropped to 4,894 megabytes, and the usage remained almost the same with the R9 290 at 3,781 megabytes. Keeping it at DirectX 12 but moving to 1440p, the 1070 VRAM usage increased to 6,941 megabytes, almost 7 gigabytes. The 1660 Ti increased to 5,191 megabytes, and now the R9 290 is maxing out its frame buffer at 4,050 megabytes. 1070 seem to use 1 GB more VRAM in all scenarios than the 1660 Ti, despite the fact that the 1660 Ti still hadn't maxed out its 6 GB limit. If we're taking a look at the CPU and GPU utilization with the DirectX 11 and DirectX 12, we can see that using the 1070, the i5-6600K is working overtime to get on top with an average, and I repeat, this is an average CPU usage of 100%, meaning it's pretty much working at full capacity under the entire benchmarking run. The R5, or the Ryzen, has a lot more threads, so it only saw an average utilization of 56%. The FX8350 was also working hard at 97% average usage, and the Phenom II X6 1090T is also putting in the work with 94% average usage. With the FX and Phenom, the average GPU usage also dropped below 90%, which would explain their poor performance in the previous tests. Switching to DirectX 12 is really helping out the i5, which is dropping from 100% to 78% average CPU usage. The Ryzen actually increased under DirectX 12 to 64% usage, still has quite a bit of headroom. The FX8350 is still working fairly hard with 93% average CPU usage, and the Phenom saw the lowest GPU usage, despite the CPU usage being fairly high with 86%. So, in conclusion then, if you are playing Division 2, please do yourself a favor and switch to DirectX 12. There is really no downside in doing this, in my experience. And the only reason you shouldn't do this is if your graphics card doesn't support DirectX 12, or if you're on Windows 7, although I think that there are some rumors that is getting DirectX 12 support, so, well, we'll see. Another thing of note is that using the built-in benchmark, the i5 6600K is consistently coming out on top, but in my previous video, where I tested in the game, it was quite a way behind the Ryzen. And as I mentioned at the start of this video, those numbers are still accurate. So even though the i5 is coming out on top in these tests, when actually playing the game, I feel that you're better off with not necessarily a Ryzen CPU, but something with more than 4 strong cores without hyper-threading. So a newer i5 or an older i7. So anyway, I hope this video helped you in some way. I should probably do some studying now, so farewell.